Believe it or not, Pokemon fan games have been around for a very long time. Ever since the development kit known as Pokemon Essentials was released in the early 2000s, fans have been obsessed with creating and playing fan-made Pokemon games. So in this video, I'll be taking a look at the last decade and a half of fan games, and deciding which ones were the best of each year. And just like my ROM-hack version of this video, I'll be scoring them on how worthwhile they are to play in 2025. That way, you'll probably be leaving this video with a new game to play. But without further ado, let's get started. So, the early fan game scene was admittedly pretty depressing. Scrolling through the early days of Poke Community, you'll find dozens of projects with new regions, custom tiles, and even new Pokemon. But they're all abandoned by what looks to be a common trend of just not being able to find enough contributing developers to actually complete the game. But in 2010, that drought finally ended, with the completed release of Pokemon Raptor, which I'm almost certain was the first completed fan game using the Essentials development kit. For a game that's development started in 2007, it's pretty impressive. It has a full new region to explore, and a not half bad Pokemon variety from the first 4 generations. But obviously, with older fan games and ROM hacks, always comes a ton of bad game design choices. First of all, the story isn't anything special, just traveling the region, collecting 8 gym badges, and stopping an evil team. The same can be said for the maps, as I found 90% of the routes to be just grassy paths surrounded by trees. But, alright, this was the early 2000s, and other than the mainline games, these developers didn't have much else to take inspiration from. So those issues can easily be excused, and surely the game can still be enjoyed, right? Well, not exactly, as the poor game design goes even deeper, with insanely slow animations, and very small amounts of EXP to be gained from battles, leaving me with not much motivation to train anything but my starter. It was very impressive back then, but it's definitely a product of its time. I'm going to give it a 10% on the playability scale. If you want to see how far the scene has come, then I think you could get a kick out of it, but other than that, you're better off playing pretty much anything else. Now, if you clicked on this video and thought you'd only find games made with Pokemon Essentials, then you'd be wrong. Well, honestly, only because there was literally nothing else to put for 2011. So I went ahead and picked a fan game that I'm sure everyone over the age of 20 has played before. This is Pokemon Tower Defense, a browser-based Pokemon strategy game. You'll begin by picking a starter, and then are immediately thrown into battle. The gameplay is fairly simple. You place a Pokemon on the field, and you watch it attack. You can level them up using money obtained during battle, and change which moves they spam. Pokemon can be captured once their health bar reaches red, and then immediately join you on the field. The battles can even be sped up, so you aren't spending too much time watching them. Although, the story isn't anything to write home about, and seems to only exist just to give the player a sense of direction. But there's actually a full second game as well, that takes place in the Johto region. And unlike the first, you'll actually be able to move around, rather than just selecting a level. The gameplay is just dumb fun, and it's a nice way to pass the time if you have nothing else to play. Not to mention, it can be played on both iOS and Android as well. But I won't lie, they do feel very dated, thanks to their sound effect and music choices that just made me mute the game after 5 minutes of playing. And I do think my enjoyment was mostly carried by nostalgia, so I'm going to give them a 50% on the playability scale. 2012 was yet another slow year for the scene, but there was at least the release of Pokemon Island. At first glance, the gameplay is pretty basic. It takes place on a small island where you catch Pokemon, so you can participate in a Coliseum to battle tons of trainers. Now, I have to admit, it was a pretty impressive game for its time, but despite receiving content updates up to 2024, it doesn't feel like the gameplay has evolved very much. The overworlds are very bland, bland, and there's a huge lack of move animations and engaging music choices. I don't really want to spend too much time talking about the game, as I don't have many positive things to say. It was a pretty empty year for the fan game scene, and just its existence back then was enough to put it here. Although I will compliment that the developer has created tons of public scripts and features for many others to use in their fan games, many of which I even use in my own. So I can't deny that the game hasn't impacted the community in a positive way, but I will be giving it a very low score of 20% on the playability scale. As in 2025, I think you're better off playing any other battle-focused fan game or ROM hack. 2013 was, again, another slow year for the scene. Less projects were being abandoned, but that was really only thanks to how little was being created in the first place. But we did see the release of Zeta and Omicron. Now, interestingly enough, Zeta and Omicron were two separate games that tried to replicate the concept of Game Freak doing the same thing for their releases. Thankfully, this idea wasn't popularized in the future fan game community because version exclusives feel kind of pointless in an offline game. But onto the actual games, your story will begin with your hometown under attack by Team Asgard or Team Olympus, and during your escape, you'll be handed one of 3 starters. I found the starters to be pretty interesting, as they've all had their stats and evolution levels modified to feel more like your traditional ones. The region is pretty big with a lot of routes and towns, but you will find them to look pretty identical to each other, due to the lack of any custom tiles. The Pokemon variety is pretty good though, with the first 5 generations available. I have to admit, I don't really have much else to say about this game. Its story and difficulty levels are pretty average, and the music choices are very bland, but it does hold up pretty well with an almost complete lack of bugs, and even a second region to explore. I'm going to give it a 50% on the playability scale, as I don't think it's worth your time if you're looking for something unique, but if you're not picky about graphics and just want a laid-back adventure, it's not a bad game to try. 2014 wasn't actually a bad year for the scene. A couple projects saw their completion, and many others saw releases of a demo. But we also had the release of a fan game that seriously stood out among everything else currently available, and that was thanks to its unique story and music choices. This is Pokemon Legends of the Arena, and I'm sure you're wondering what makes it so special. First of all, it doesn't follow the expected gym challenge story. Rather, you'll play as a trainer participating in the International Pokemon Championships, a series of tournaments hosted around the region. As you progress, you'll meet various characters and learn more about the secrets hidden behind the IPC. The region is pretty well put together, using a Generation 4 art style to help bring it to life. Now, as good as the story was, the gameplay is a bit of a mixed bag in terms of quality. The dex consists of Pokemon from the first 4 generations, and your starter will be one of the evolutions based on your answers to a personality test. But for a game focused on Pokemon battles, I can't say they were that immersive. There's a massive amount of moves that just don't have animations, making it pretty pointless to play with them enabled. But my biggest issue with the game would have to be the wild encounter rates. They're just so high, and that's something you'll see trying to navigate the forest at the start of the game. But for 2014, I do have to give the developer credit for creating something really unique for the time period. I'm going to be giving Legends of the Arena a 55% on the playability scale. Its story will keep you engaged, but again, for a game centered around Pokemon battles, I was pretty disappointed with them. 2015 hit us with a very impressive Pokemon fan game, one with new Pokemon that all have their sprites animated. This is Pokemon Spectrum, and for an almost decade-old project, it's filled with a ton of mind-blowing features, from animated battle sprites on custom battle backgrounds to Pokemon following you in the overworld. The story is pretty basic though, as it just follows a new trainer on a journey to collect 8 gym badges. But with all the new Pokemon and its new region region to explore, I wasn't bothered by the plot's simplicity. I certainly do think the game deserves a spot as the best Pokemon fan game of 2015, but there are two things that are holding me back from giving it a high rating on the playability scale. First of all, the game hasn't received an update in almost 6 years. Of course, it is still being worked on, as the developer did state that they're remaking most of the game to update it to a newer version of Pokemon Essentials, but I know many people don't want to invest time into something that won't be finished for a while. Secondly, the early game is kind of a chore to play through. You have to navigate through a big forest filled with trainers that kind of overlevel you, and thanks to the potions costing 600 Pokédollars for some reason, I found myself constantly backtracking to the Pokemon Center. So I really hope that's something the developer resolves in their process of remaking the game. But I'll be giving Spectrum a 45% on the playability scale, as I think you can find some enjoyment in its current state, but again, it's a big time investment for something that won't be finished for who knows how many years. I'm pretty sure just about everyone who clicked on this video knew exactly what game was going to the 2016 spot, and I would be an idiot to think any other release this year belongs there. That's obviously Pokemon Uranium. Everyone knows what it is, and everyone knows what happened to it in 2016, so I won't really spend much time talking about that side of it. But something I think a lot of newcomers to the scene fail to understand is that Pokemon Uranium wasn't just another fan game. It accomplished things that at the time, no other project had ever done before. It had a completely new region and an almost entirely original soundtrack. And oh yeah, over 100 new Pokemon, some of which even had animated sprites. It had a level of overworld visual quality that rivaled the Nintendo DS games, despite being built on a 2D landscape. Not to mention, its soundtrack is just amazing. Out of all the things you can do to rival the work of the official games, the music is definitely one of the most impressive ones to get right. And yes, I am aware that there were a handful of other fan games with similar content released around this time. But what separates Uranium from the rest of them is the fact that it was actually delivered as a finished game. Where Pokemon Uranium starts to fall apart though, is its balance. I talked about it a lot more in depth in my top 10 Fakemon fan game video, but Uranium has one of the worst EXP curves I've ever seen. Pokemon gain EXP very slowly, even when fighting opponents 3 to 4 levels above them. And even though there is a way to rebattle trainers, it's still going to take you an incredibly long time to build your team, forcing me to use my starter for 80% of the battles before the 3rd gym. Underneath those issues, I still think Uranium is an incredibly well-made game, and can certainly be enjoyed with its beautiful region and incredible new Pokemon roster. So I'm going to be giving it a 65% on the playability scale. 3 years after the release of Zeta and Omicron, the creator returned with a new game that was much bigger and much better. Obviously, everyone knows what it is, and that's Pokemon Insurgents. Now, being a completed fan game with a new region and story, it was bound to be popular, especially during a time where fan games were being abandoned left and right. But Insurgents had an extra gimmick that separated itself from every other Pokemon game, including the official ones, and that's its gigantic roster of regional variants, or better known as Delta Pokemon. Delta Pokemon were special because they weren't just given an extra type or a small stat boost. They felt brand new all around, with new moves and drastic type swaps. They kind of felt like new Pokemon, except you could still recognize what was originally there. As cool as the Delta forms were though, a lot of them were locked to the post-game, which obviously felt kind of lame, because at that point your adventure was pretty much already over. Speaking of the adventure, Insurgents takes you through the region of Tauren, that's fallen into chaos due to the existence of the 5 cults. Each cult worships a different legendary Pokemon, and you'll be tasked with taking them down as the story progresses. But one of the biggest pieces of criticism Insurgents gets hit with is that it's incredibly edgy. Now, call me crazy, but I kind of disagree. The biggest and really only example I see people use is the Darkrai cultist being unalived at the start of the game, which, yeah, that's fair to call edgy, but after that, nothing else really happens. Sure, some people do lose their lives, but it's actually important to the story, rather than just for nothing. If I had to criticize the plot for anything, I'd say it felt incredibly underwhelming. Once you get to the third gym, you kind of start to take down cult leaders pretty quickly. I feel like the story could have been a lot more interesting if it only focused on one or two of the cults, instead of 5. Finally, my biggest issue with Insurgents: the music. Yes, there are some good soundtracks in the game, especially for some of the cult leaders, but for the most part, the music choices are incredibly bland. There are about 7 or 8 tracks shared across the game's massive amount of overworld maps, and most of them are just the stock music that comes with the Essentials development kit. Something I feel a lot of developers forget about is the quality of the default trainer music. This is what your players are going to listen to for about 40% of the game. Overall, Pokemon Insurgents just hasn't aged very well. On top of all the other issues I complained about, the performance is also pretty bad, so you will be running into a lot of lag if you choose to speed up the game. But I still think there's a good amount of fun to be had with its insane number of regional forms and the new region to explore, so I'll be giving it a 70% on the playability scale. 2018 was the year that the fan game scene was starting to take an interesting turn, as dozens of new projects were being released thanks to the Relic Castle game jams. But above all else was the release of a now completed game called Pokemon Empyrean. The biggest draw of the game would have to be the story, and I'll admit it always gave me a feeling I can't exactly describe. The beginning of the game feels pretty ordinary. You're a brand new trainer ready to receive your starter, and then travel the region to collect its 8 gym badges, and save your father from the antagonist group. Even the starting areas of the game are pretty generic, but as you progress, you'll slowly start to feel that something is off. Something about the world you're in and the enemies you're chasing just doesn't add up, until it finally hits you, and it's one of the most interesting directions I've seen a story in a fan game take. So much so that I don't even want to spoil an ounce of it. So let's move on to the gameplay, which doesn't disappoint either. Pokemon from the first 7 generations are available to capture, alongside some regional forms and a couple of Fakemon, which I chose to ignore, not really caring for the designs of them. You'll have 3 different difficulty modes to choose from, allowing the game to be enjoyed by any type of player. But I have heard from many others that the latter half of the game on the hardest difficulty does require a lot of grinding. I do have 2 additional pieces of criticism to add though. First of all, there's once again a big lack of move animations, and a big lack of battle music choices. The music isn't bad, but you might find yourself getting easily tired of the few tracks that exist. Overall though, I think Empyrean is a fun game with a long story, and there's even an officially supported mod that adds extra content and quality of life features, so I'm going to be giving it an 80% on the playability scale. Now, I'm sure a few people who have been in the community for many years are going to question why this game is here instead of Phoenix Rising, a beautiful fan game that had the entire scene in a chokehold when it was first released in the summer of 2018. Well, I actually was originally going to have it here, but after a bit more research, I decided to choose Empyrean over it, as I didn't feel like it was fair to choose a completely abandoned fan game over a project that was actually finished until the end. So for some reason, 2019 was just a terrible year for both the fan game and ROM hacking scene. Like, there were a few small projects here and there, and no disrespect to them, but there weren't any groundbreaking or super memorable new games. So I thought I'd use that as an excuse to talk about my favorite one, that would be getting a spot on this list either way. Pokemon Rejuvenation is, well, a really good game. Taking place in the massive region of Avium, you're a brand new trainer ready to begin a Pokemon journey, but after your cruise gets hijacked, you're then given a new mission of saving your mother from the antagonist group, Team Zen. You'll arrive in East Giron City, and are given the option between 24 different starters. As much as that might have been to take in, this is just the beginning of your adventure. An adventure that'll take you across multiple islands, ancient civilizations, and even through other worlds. you'll meet dozens of different characters and face off against many different foes. It's undeniably the biggest story I've ever seen in a Pokemon fan game, with an average playtime of around 60 to 70 hours. But that's just the main story, as there are plenty of side quests to complete as well. Most of them, especially in the early game, won't be much more than just retrieving an item or a more difficult than average battle. As you progress though, you'll unlock much bigger ones that'll take you through parts of the game's world you would have missed otherwise. But story isn't everything, and thankfully, Rejuvenation has a semi-unique gameplay mechanic called field effects. Basically, imagine electric or grassy terrain, but for like every environment. For example, in a forest, grass and bug type moves will deal 50% increased damage, and a few slicing moves like Air Cutter will deal extra grass type damage as well. Obviously, it goes a lot deeper than that with 48 different fields, all with their own unique effects, but if you aren't a fan of those, there is a lower difficulty mode that does lower their presence in the game. With its massive story, beautiful world, and engaging gameplay, this segment just can't be long enough to say everything I want to about the game. I will be eventually making a full video on it, but for now, I'm going to give Rejuvenation a 99% on the playability scale. Even if you are someone who only wants to play something that's 100% completed, I seriously feel that the game will give you a much longer and fulfilling experience than almost any other finished project. 2020 was a bit better than 2019, with a few new completed games, but the fan game I decided to choose for this year was one that I feel has one of the best written plots in Pokemon fan projects. This is Pokemon Desolation, a game highly inspired by both Reborn and Rejuvenation. To start off, I will say that Desolation follows the standard progression system normal Pokemon games do, defeating gym leaders and collecting their badges. But that's about it when comparing it to a Game Freak title, as the game has a very interesting story gimmick you won't find in many other projects. And that's dialogue choices. And I don't mean picking between two things to say, only to get an extra bit of info or reaction out of the characters. No, these can significantly impact your relationship with others, and even the course of the story. Obviously, don't go in expecting 50 different endings, but you can control a lot of different things, even whether or not certain characters will lose their lives. But other than that, Desolation also has an incredible cast of characters. Despite being inspired by Reborn and Rejuvenation, I will say that it doesn't go overboard with the character bloat, and I had no problem remembering any of them. What I have to especially compliment the story about, though, is its plot twists. Desolation takes some of the most interesting turns I've ever seen in a fan project. So much so that I highly suggest taking breaks in between play sessions, and not try to race your way through it. As for the gameplay, it's almost identical to that of Reborn and Rejuvenation, with field effects and gameplay modifiers via passwords, so I won't spend any time repeating myself. One thing I did want to add is that despite many people believing so, Desolation is not abandoned. The lead developer did step away for personal reasons, but the development is still going well, with new additions to the team and bi-monthly developer updates. But in its current state, the game still has around 50 hours of story content available, so I think it's about 95% worth playing, with that missing 5% really only for the players who truly desire a finished game. So, I think it's finally time for me to admit that I've spent way too much time talking about Xenoverse. But considering it's the most notable and arguably the best Pokemon fan game released in 2021, I decided to instead talk about what I actually like about the game. First of all, if you've been living under a rock, Xenoverse is a completed Pokemon fan game with a new region, story, and roster of Pokemon. The new Pokemon and forms would have to be the best part about the game. They look incredible in battle with their sprites animated, and you can tell just how much thought went into each of their designs, as each one has its own piece of artwork rather than a small party sprite. The same thing can be said for the characters. I don't really like the overworld art style, but I can't deny that each one of them having their own full art mugshot isn't cool. On to what I don't like, well, there is quite a bit of it. But since I'm taking a more unbiased viewpoint with this video, I decided to only list the things that I feel are objectively wrong. First of all, I talked about this in my top 10 Fakemon fan game video, but I feel Xenoverse's new Pokemon count felt a lot lower than it really was, leaving me with a team that was pretty identical to everyone else's, and that's mostly due to two things. First of all, trying to split them way too evenly across the entire game, and second of all, locking a lot of evolutions behind 1% drop rates or late game item shops. A lot of developers think that getting that 1% item or 1% encounter rate is supposed to feel rewarding, but all it does is waste the player's time. And the only feeling you get from it is the relief that you can finally continue playing, knowing you finally got it. Secondly, the pacing. Xenoverse isn't that long of a game, clocking you 15, maybe 20 hours to finish its main story. But I can't lie that in between the important story beats, the game felt very slow, just running through copious amounts of trainers who felt very boring to battle thanks to the AI spamming random moves. And I get that's a problem with most other fan games as well, but it stands out in Xenoverse due to the lack of the fast forward button. And finally, even with how impressive the moving sprites were, the lack of battle animations was pretty disappointing. So much so that this is one of the few Pokemon games I actually turned them off. But I think I've spent way too much time talking about the game, even with how much I personally dislike other aspects about it. Maybe it was just the frustration that every other YouTuber failed to point out its flaws, calling it a masterpiece, or the best fan game ever made, or my fear that all the one-sided praise would leave the developer's original monster taming game to have the same problems. But since the latter obviously isn't the case, I think I'm going to put my discussions of the game to a rest. As for the playability scale, well, I think it's about 90% worth trying. Most people did enjoy their experience with it, but many people, including myself, found the gameplay, story, and/or graphics to be lackluster. So don't take my word for it, and go give it a try if you haven't already. Pokemon Reborn is arguably one of the most disliked Pokemon fan games ever created, for criticisms of its edgy dialogue and grindy gameplay. But what a lot of the community fails to realize is that in 2022, Reborn received an update that not only completed the game, but almost completely revamped its previously available content. If you don't know, Pokemon Reborn is a massive fan game with over 18 gym leaders, and an equally as big post-game with a side quest for almost every legendary. I bet you've never heard of a Pokemon game like that before, have you? However, unlike most Pokemon games, Reborn starts you in a massive city that hasn't been very well taken care of. But as the hero of the story, you have the power to change that, and that's something you'll see as you progress through the game. Reborn also features the same field effect mechanic I talked about in the 2019 segment, so despite the game using only canon Pokemon from the first 7 generations, the battles will still feel interesting. Now, onto the criticisms that more than half the community shares about the game, I wanted to first start with the grind. Now, let me tell you, Reborn can be a grindy game, but you can also choose for it not to be. When you start a new save, you'll be asked if you want to input any passwords, which can completely change the game in any way you want. So if you found the boss trainers to be too difficult, you can input a password to make them have lower stats. If you found the game to be too grindy, you can input a password that spawns an NPC to dispense you free EXP candies in the hub. Want to skip every puzzle? There's a password for that. Want to start with the EXP All, Mega Ring, and/or Shiny Charm? There's a password for that. Do you want to be able to skip any trainer you want? There's a password for that. There are so many passwords, and most of them can be enabled at the same time. And if you were wondering, the same password system also exists in both the 2019 and 2020 segment games. Now, onto criticisms of the story. I'll admit, I'm not the biggest fan of it either. I never found myself too attached to any of the characters, but I have to say that the writing has significantly improved over the years. Yes, it's still a dark story, but it feels a lot more like an engaging narrative you'd find find in a professional piece of work, rather than a poorly written fan fiction that everyone seems to think it is. But as much as I know a lot of people are going to disagree, I'm going to give Pokemon Reborn an 100% on the playability scale. It's a fan game I think every hardcore Pokemon fan should at least give a try. And even if you don't like the story, the world, gameplay mechanics, and quality of life will make up for that. 2023 was an absolutely phenomenal year for the scene. It felt like something new was popping up every week, and all three of my personal favorites at the time had received massive updates this year. But there was one fan game in particular that saw its completed release this year, a project that I believe makes every single Pokemon battle a fun one, and that would be Pokemon Tectonic. Now, hold on, that's a really big claim. I mean, come on, it's a Pokemon game. Surely, most of the battles will be boring, right? So what exactly does Tectonic do to spice up every fight? First of all, every Pokemon and every move has received a change in some way. Some of them are drastic, and others are small enough to just comply with other massive changes in the game. And you'll be using a lot of those moves, because Pokemon gain a massive amount of coverage options just by leveling up. And across the game's massive region, you'll find Pokemon from the first 8 generations available to capture, and thanks to the number of routes, and there being multiple encounter pools on each of them, finding the ones you want won't take very long at all. But I'm sure while taking all that in, you might think that sounds a bit overwhelming. Now, I don't blame you, and I would almost agree with you. If it weren't for the fact that everything you need to know about the game exists, well, in the game, there are options in the pause menu that tell you where to go, give you information about every Pokemon and move, whether you own them or not, and a full guide on how every system in the game works. As for the story, I can't say it's anything super groundbreaking. It's not bad, and it will do a fine job of taking you through the game. But Tectonic has so many features that I'd probably need a full video to talk about all of them. I'm going to be giving it a 90% on the playability scale, because if you like Pokemon battles, it's an absolute must-play of a game. 2024. We're finally here. A year that's undoubtedly, absolutely undeniably, the best year the fan game scene has ever had. Starting with Pokerogue's release in the early spring, becoming one of the fastest growing fan games in recent history, to the English release of Unbreakable Ties in the late summer. A beautiful game with some of the best cutscenes I've ever seen in a fan project. I'll be honest, out of every year in this video, 2024 was the hardest one to pick a single project to represent it. So after a lot of thinking, I decided to choose one that absolutely blew up on YouTube this year, due to what I think is mostly thanks to my initial video about it. And that's the big update to Pokemon Reloaded, the fan game with real-time combat. Your journey begins in the Star region, as a trainer who, like many others, has a dream to become the very best. At first, you're given the simple quest of filling the Pokedex and collecting 8 gym badges, but as you progress, you'll run into different evil teams from previous games. Now, I'm not going to lie, the story was definitely the weakest part about the experience. It felt like every middle schooler's confusing dream game, of throwing every evil team and legendary into a single story. But I guess that kind of makes sense, considering its development originally started over a decade ago. But obviously, the story is far from the best part about the game. Like I said earlier, all Pokemon battles are done in real time, where you'll command your Pokemon to move around the field and use key-binded moves to attack. Power points work more like a stamina bar, having to recharge with stronger move uses, and accuracy and evasion lowering moves have been reworked to fit the new combat style. But I do have to say that the game is very long, and I mean that in both a positive and negative way. There's an insane amount of content, with its massive region, and 2 extra ones featuring the gym leaders from the first 5 generations. But on the contrary, the real-time battles will take you on average 3 to 4 times longer than your turn-based ones, especially without the speed-up button normally offered in these fan games. So trying to finish the game in its entirety will take hundreds of hours, which is something that'll excite some players, but also scare others. Overall though, I think it's an incredible game, developed over 15 years, and finally receiving its semi-completed version in 2024. So I'm going to give it a 90% on the playability scale. asking the same question I did at the end of my ROM-hack video: have we really gotten anywhere after all this time? I think the answer is pretty obvious. In just the last 5 years, the quality and performance levels of Pokemon fan games have drastically improved. Not to mention that between 2023 and 2024, we saw over 200 fan games being released on PokeCommunity. And those super high quality projects we used to consider a once in a few year experience seem to be popping up every other month now. And with the insane number of free-to-use resources for Essentials-based fan games, the amount of projects being abandoned has dropped significantly. So not only have we come incredibly far, but the future of fan games looks incredibly bright. But anyways, thank you for watching, and be sure to subscribe to keep up with all the upcoming fan games and ROM hacks. And thank you to my channel members for their continued support. I hope you have a nice rest of your day, and goodbye!